There's been so much focus on Ferrari's difficult start to the 2019 Formula 1 season over the first 6 races, and most of that focus has been on what's going wrong with the car. But is that overshadowing other problems with Ferrari and perhaps other weaknesses? I've got Ed Straw and Scott Mitchell here to discuss just that. Scott, we're not here to talk about what's going wrong with the car. You guys have done that extensively recently already. But there's something else seemingly going wrong at Ferrari at the moment. What is it?
Well, we saw a high-profile example of this in Monaco in qualifying when they completely blundered Charles Leclerc's weekend by getting the qualifying strategy completely wrong. And it's that word, strategy. I just think on the race operations side, there's an old weakness of Ferrari that's still kicking around. There's a new broom has swept through Maranello, but yeah, there's still this lingering strategic problem of old, I think, that's rearing its head a bit too much at the start of the season.
So let's go back then, look through the first few races. Ed, take us and your own mind back to Australia. Ferrari, the main story coming out of it was that they were stunned at how far behind Mercedes they were. But how did they run the race there?
Not too bad. I mean, their fundamental problem there was they just weren't quick enough. That was their big problem. They did miss perhaps an opportunity to go for fastest lap with Charles Leclerc, who was at the back of Class A, as we like to call it, and had enough space late in the race to do that had he wanted to, because obviously Bottas took fastest lap on older tyres, so maybe there was a point left aside there. So not a major criticism, but just a small missed opportunity there.
Yeah, and in fact, it seemed that I almost wondered if Ferrari were worried that if he did put new tyres on, he still wouldn't go faster than the Mercedes. Scott, things were a lot more rosy in Bahrain until Leclerc's car problem cost him the victory. So was that a case of a smooth weekend?
It was probably their best all-round weekend of the season. Obviously the car was really quick, which helps. It always puts everyone in a good frame of mind, and everything's easier when you're quick. And the race was being managed pretty well. The only blot on the copybook, I think, on the operations side in Bahrain was probably the attempt at the start of the race to keep Leclerc behind Vettel. It was quite obvious that Leclerc was faster, but they did try to keep him behind, and then half a lap later he proved how much faster he was by blasting past and nailing him into turn one. And even Vettel said afterwards that he completely understands why that happens, because he wasn't particularly happy in the car. But sort of like Ed said, in Australia they had another problem, which was the pace of the car. In Bahrain, the car was quick, but at both races, we just started to see this little insight into Ferrari clearly has an idea of how it wants its team orders to work. It wants to prioritise Vettel where possible. But in Australia and Bahrain, we just saw that little bit of, have they executed that? Could they have been a little bit sharper with how they operated it?
And then, of course, Ed, we had a much bigger case of team orders discussion in China, where it seemed that Ferrari's race was constantly dictated by what it was or wasn't doing with the order of its drivers from the pit wall.
Yeah, I think Ferrari may be a little bit slow in ordering Leclerc to let Vettel past in the first stint. I think they wanted that situation to resolve itself organically and didn't want to be too interventionist in it, and of course that cost them a little bit. And then, the timing of the pit stops went great, and we did see Leclerc was left out in his first stint, certainly 3 laps longer than he needed to be, and in his battle with Verstappen, which he ultimately lost, he was losing on his in-lap he lost like 3 and a bit seconds, and on the 3 laps before that he was losing something like 2.3 seconds, 2.2 seconds to Verstappen. So when he came back out, he was miles behind Verstappen basically. So I think you can make a case either way on the team orders thing. I think maybe they're a little bit hesitant, but just they left Leclerc out too long for no real gain. He was going to lose track position anyway, but you can lose track position, but you don't have to give away a heap of time as well. I think that was a mistake.
That was one of the examples, I think, of what we used to refer to as the Raikkonen strategy, wasn't it? Bizarrely be left out for a late pit stop.
Forgetting your other cars in the race.
Yeah, it doesn't pay you back at any point, really. Now, no team orders, Scott, to discuss in Baku. It looked like a race that Ferrari could have won until Leclerc crashed in qualifying. Leclerc's strategy was in focus during the race because he went long, and then there was all the talk about should he have been pitted at a time where he could have had some track position. But we've kind of debunked that one already, haven't we? Because the tyre life just wouldn't have worked. So was there actually anything really that Ferrari got wrong in Azerbaijan?
Well, once the race had played out, it became clear that actually what they wanted to do tyre-wise worked pretty effectively for them. And we've seen this year that different teams at different times have struggled with tyre management or getting them in the right operating window and keeping them there. So Ferrari obviously felt that was going to be their best option tyre-wise, but it did play a part in that Leclerc qualifying crash, because ultimately you go out on the harder compound trying to make it through Q2 with the slightly harder compound, and yes, that set him up best for the race, but ultimately when he had that shunt at the entry to the castle section, Vettel came really close to doing the same, and it all comes because you're either trying to take extra risk because you're having to push harder to get the lap time out of the tyres, or you're not entirely confident about what the car's going to do because you've been doing your qualifying runs on the softest compound and suddenly you're not on it anymore. So I think that did play a part. The way it worked out, I guess you could say, you could argue that was the best thing to do, but it was almost like a bit of a precursor to what happened in Monaco. It doesn't matter if you're doing theoretically the right thing because it will give you the best tyres later on, if you never actually get there, because that tyre choice plays a part in knocking you out earlier in the session.
Ed, we will come back to Monaco to finish off, but just looking at Spain, Ferrari are obviously incredibly disappointed with how far they seem to fall away from the ever-improving Mercedes in the Spanish Grand Prix. But this was another one that appeared to be all about team orders between Vettel and Leclerc again, didn't it?
Yeah, we had it in both stints. The first stint, Leclerc was behind Vettel. Eventually, they swapped them round, probably a little bit too late. And then in the second stint, this was the one that really baffled me. They left Vettel on a different strategy, on the quicker tyre, part behind Leclerc for 10 laps. Absolutely no reason for that. He eventually got let past him and then pulled a load of time, but he was in the pits very quickly afterwards. So he just lost a heap of time. There was no reason for that. Once you're on offset strategies, it's just racing strategy 101, not to let your cars get in the way of each other. So I feel like, again, they just wanted it to resolve itself organically, which isn't very likely to happen in Barcelona. I feel that there's a pattern of them needing to make these tougher decisions rather than just hoping they'll go away.
And we saw that, of course, last year in the German Grand Prix, where Raikkonen was left out in front of Vettel, and Vettel was getting incredibly agitated and obviously crashed out of that race when the rain started to fall. Scott, we've mentioned Monaco a few times already. Mattia Binotto took the slightly surprising decision as Ferrari team principal to hold an impromptu media session after Saturday's disaster. Did he perhaps shed some light on what Ferrari's going to try and do to rectify these problems that we've seen so far this year?
Well, he thinks that they've got the right people in place, and he thinks that they've got the right tools and ways of going about it. They just need to be sharper with that process. And what they got wrong in Monaco was misjudging the cut-off time, which is really, really hard to do when it's based on real-time data. So obviously the way that they'd obviously set their parameters or how they calculate a margin for track improvement over the course of the session, or how much they think another driver will gain by going out and getting another run, which obviously in Monaco is worth a lot more. They got that wrong, so they need to be sharper on that, but also from a senior team personnel point of view, they need to be more wary of what's going on so they can actually overrule that system. I asked Binotto if he felt that he should have overruled it, and he said obviously in hindsight yes, but in the moment you sort of think, well, even if I doubt this, the tools say it's going to be okay, and if you've got that data, if you're going to put all that effort in to trust it, you do have to trust it. He said that they were aware it was going to be tight, but they were confident it was going to pull through. I think it was a needless risk. Binotto, accepted that it was a risk that ultimately wasn't worthwhile, to basically leave yourself such a fine margin when it's make or break for your race weekend.
All of these things are risk versus reward, and the reward of Leclerc not going out again was that he'd have then had another set of softs for later in the session. So that's very useful to have, but the risk was sky high at Monaco, of all places. And I just think when you're processing the data, you've kind of got this rolling model going on. So they're very, very good at doing that, but it's only as good as the data that's there. And if you take a track like Monaco, where there's good, significant track evolution, where driver confidence is a big thing, particularly after they've had a sighter run. So there's all these factors, notwithstanding the fact that Leclerc didn't have the best first run. So just all these factors together, I think there's a point where we have to go, this is a bit dicey. Let's just make the decision to go out again and ensure that we don't drop the ball on this one, because it ruined Leclerc's weekend utterly.
I think what happened in Monaco was pretty much a microcosm of Ferrari's whole season operationally, where everything they did was sort of right in principle, they just didn't really do a very good job of it in practice. Like, for example, Spain, I know Ed and I disagree over what happened with the Leclerc-Vettel positioning in the second part of the race, because I think when you're trying to play devil's advocate and try and work out what they were doing, I sort of took Ferrari at their word, which was effectively that they're worried that you lose a bit of time by swapping them, and then you might potentially damage Leclerc's race by having him stuck a second or two behind a car in dirty air. I actually think in reality Vettel would have scarpered clear, so there wouldn't have been that worry. But it's almost like they're trying to consider a little bit too much, and as Ed said, sometimes they're kind of just hoping that it will fix itself. They've got all this right intention, whether it's team orders, whether it's saving themselves a set of tyres, being on the right tyres, all of these things are correct, and then they're just not Mercedes, are they? They're just missing something at the end.
And there's no point worrying about not losing a second if you're going to give away 7 seconds in doing so. And like in Spain, Leclerc was defending a bit as well, so that'll cost that. So it's just not taking control of a situation and trying to minimise the variables. I mean, the thing we do have to say is we are focusing on the operational side here, but fundamentally, if Ferrari had aced the strategy every race, they weren't going to be winning all the races. The fundamental problem is their car is not quick enough, or to be more precise, they can't get to the peaks of that car very, very often, unless except in the warm conditions of somewhere like Bahrain. So that's the fundamental problem. But if you can extrapolate from this, it's always harder when you're behind. Being up front gives you more leeway. But if you say had Ferrari and Mercedes on equal levels, would we be sat here saying, well, actually, Ferrari, every time there's a strategy decision, they've got it wrong 5 times and Mercedes got it only wrong once, shall we say? That would make a huge difference in the general reckoning. Ferrari has to be ready, if and when it gets its car as sharp as they want it to be able to operationally maximise what they're doing. If they've got the drivers getting in each other's way and they're not taking control of that situation, that is going to cost them.